A city block was ripped open in Chicago, and men worked at the bottom of it in winter steam, rebar cages rising like black ribs while cranes swung tons of steel overhead. One slip was enough to turn a paycheck into a funeral, yet the schedule never slowed. That's the dark truth behind Willis Tower. It wasn't built by inspiration, it was built by momentum. So what did momentum actually cost the people inside that hole? I'm James. To understand how this tower was really built, then called the Sears Tower, you have to start with the mindset. This wasn't just another job. It was a corporate statement during a shaky era, engineered to be taller, faster, and more efficient than anything Chicago had seen. When a project is sold as a symbol, every delay becomes a threat. And once a delay becomes a threat, safety turns into something men are expected to carry privately, like a prayer they don't say out loud. The site looked innocent from the sidewalk, just fences, warning signs, and a rough grid of trucks. But step inside and the ground fell away. The excavation was a carved-out basin of mud, steel, and noise. Pumps thumped day and night, fighting groundwater. Concrete trucks backed in with their engines screaming. A foreman's voice cut through it all, sharp and flat. Keep your head. Keep moving. Down in the pit, men laid out rebar like they were knitting the future into place. The cages rose in tall rectangles, tight-spaced and unforgiving. A boot between bars wasn't just a stumble, it was a trap. Above them, a crane floated a load of formwork across open air. The load looked slow from a distance. Up close, it had its own gravity. A few inches of swing could smash fingers, crush a shoulder, take a man off his feet and drop him where the rebar waited like teeth. A superintendent in a clean coat walked the perimeter with two men in hard hats and a rolled set of drawings under his arm. Bruce Graham's name moved through the site like a password. Architect, the face of the idea. And Fazlur Rahman Khan's name carried a different weight. Engineer, the mind behind the structure that would let the building stand against Chicago wind. The workers didn't need the mathematics to feel the pressure it created. They only needed to know the tower had to happen on time. A rigger on the ground crew raised his hand and called a signal. The crane operator responded with a subtle lift, and a steel bundle rose from a flatbed, hanging from cables like a suspended verdict. The rigger watched the load, watched the tagline, watched the men stepping around it. He had done this 1,000 times, which is exactly why it scared him. Routine is what convinces you nothing new can go wrong. The wind shifted. Not a storm, just a sideways push that turned the bundle a few degrees. The tagline snapped taut. A labourer reached to steady it, gloves slick with mud. His boots slid. His body leaned instinctively toward the load, and for a split second the load leaned back. Steel doesn't care about instinct. The edge caught him high in the chest and knocked the breath out of him so completely, his mouth stayed open without sound. He went down hard onto the churned earth, and a half-second later the rebar cage beside him shivered as the load brushed it. The cage flexed, snapped back, and one thin length of bar whipped free like a wire. It struck his cheek and tore a clean line from ear toward mouth. Blood hit the mud in bright drops that looked wrong against grey winter soil. Men rushed in, not heroically, carefully, because the load was still suspended, because one more step in the wrong place would create a second patient. Someone yelled for the crane to hold, someone else yelled for rags. A foreman pushed through, eyes flicking over the scene with a kind of practiced urgency that wasn't compassion or cruelty. It was containment. He checked for witnesses beyond the fence. He checked where the blood was falling. He checked whether the lane was blocked. Get him out of the swing, he ordered. Now. They dragged the man by the shoulders to a safer patch of ground. He tried to inhale and wheezed like a broken bellows. His hands clawed at his chest. His face was turning that dull, unpromising colour that made old workers look away, because they recognised it. An ambulance was called, but the first thing that changed on the site wasn't the pace, it was the picture. A tarp went up to block the view from the street. A guard stepped closer to the gate. The crane operator was waved back into motion the moment the load was stable. Back to it, the foreman said, and it wasn't said with anger, it was said like policy. To understand why that sentence matters, you need to understand the structure they were racing toward. The tower would rise as a bundled frame, multiple tubes tied together, so it could stand taller without turning into a sail. That meant an enormous amount of steel, connections and repetitive lifts. When repetition becomes the method, accidents become predictable. Not inevitable, but predictable. and predictable risks are the ones people learn to live with, until the day they don't. The injured man was carried out through a side gap in the fence. His name didn't travel. What travelled was the delay. 9 minutes, a supervisor muttered, watching his watch like the clock had more authority than blood. By afternoon, the pit was loud again. Concrete poured into forms. Rebar cages grew. Another load swung in. Men stepped around the swing radius like dancers around a blade. A young worker, new enough to still flinch at every horn blast, stared at the rebar teeth and whispered, "How many floors is this thing?" An older man didn't answer with a number. He answered with a rule. "As many as they need," he said, "so don't give them a reason to stop paying you." That's how the tower began. Before the skyline, before the postcards, before anyone renamed it. A hole in Chicago and a job site that treated momentum like a religion. Subscribe and hit like, because once the steel starts climbing, the wind becomes a second foreman, and mistakes stop landing in mud. By the second week, the hole in Chicago started to feel like the calm part of the job. The pit was brutal, yes. Mud, pumps, rebar teeth, concrete that steamed in the cold. But at least down there, gravity behaved the way a man expected. Up on the rising steel, gravity became a constant negotiation, and the wind began to make its own decisions. The first time the frame cleared the surrounding rooftops, the site changed mood. The horns sounded sharper. The shouted hand signals got faster. Men stopped walking and started edging, boots testing each step like they were reading Braille. A connector crew climbed out onto a narrow flange to catch a column coming in on a line. The column hung vertical and perfect until the wind hit it broadside, turning it into a slow, heavy pendulum. The tagline snapped tight. The cable sang. Every man on the iron froze into focus. Ray Kowalski, connector, forearm scarred, eyes always squinting against dust, raised one palm and watched the load swing with the calm of someone who'd survived by trusting timing more than faith. He didn't look down. He looked at the hook, at the bolt holes, at the exact moment the steel would try to bite him. The crane operator eased the load inward. Ray stepped forward, reached for the column, and guided it with a gloved hand that was already numb from cold. For a heartbeat it went clean, steel lining up with steel, the kind of smooth fit that makes men think the day will behave. Then a gust came through the canyon of half-built structure and open air. The column drifted a few inches offline. Ray adjusted instinctively, moving his foot to get leverage. His boot found a patch of frost on the flange, thin, almost invisible, the kind of slickness that doesn't exist in safety manuals because it looks like nothing. His heel slid. He didn't fall. He caught himself with a wrench hand and a shoulder against the column, but the saving move put him inside the danger he'd been avoiding. The steel kissed his hard hat, not enough to crush it, enough to snap his neck sideways and send a pain-hot shock down his spine. His wrench clattered once and stopped at the edge. Below, a deckman shouted, "Hold it!" The crane operator held. The load steadied. Ray stayed standing, eyes wide for one ugly second as he realized how close he'd been to becoming an example. A foreman on the steel didn't rush to check his neck. He rushed to check the hook. "Bolt it," he barked. "Bolt it now." Because the only way to make a swinging thing stop being a weapon is to make it part of the building. I want you to understand why this tower's steelwork felt like a factory line in the sky. The structure wasn't one simple spine. It was a bundled frame, multiple vertical tubes tied together so wind loads could be shared instead of concentrated. Think of it like several square towers locked side by side, acting as one. That design is what made the height possible, but it also meant an insane amount of repetitive steel placement. Columns, beams, connections. Over and over, floor after floor. Repetition makes speed possible. Repetition also makes mistakes repeatable. Ray stepped back once the bolts bit. His jaw was clenched so hard his cheek twitched. A man beside him leaned in and murmured, "You good?" Ray nodded too fast. "Yeah." The real answer was in his hands, which were shaking. Down on the deck, the day didn't pause to respect that near miss. The deck crew laid metal decking panels like giant sheets of tin, fastening them down so concrete could be poured later. The panels flexed when you stepped wrong. They rang under boots. They turned slick with dust and frost until a man had to keep his knees slightly bent just to stay honest. A runner named Miguel Santos crossed the deck with a bag of bolts, head tilted up to track a load passing overhead. The bag was heavy enough to pull his shoulder down. He moved fast anyway. Fast was the only way to avoid being yelled at. A shout came from above. "Heads!" Miguel didn't even look up. He just pressed himself closer to a column and waited out the danger the way men did when danger became routine. The danger wasn't a beam, it was a tool. A spud wrench slipped from a hand 2 floors up. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a metal object losing a grip and turning end over end through open air. It hit the deck with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, bounced once, then skidded across steel toward Miguel's boots. He jerked back, ankle catching the lip of a decking seam. His balance went for half a second, just half a second, and his bag of bolts tore from his hand. The bolts spilled, rolling and clattering, disappearing into gaps, raining down into the dark spaces below like hard metallic hail. Someone on a lower level screamed, not from fear, from impact. A bolt had found flesh. In the chaos that followed, the site did what it always did first. It stabilized the work. Men shouted for the crane to keep clear. Someone kicked the remaining bolts away from the deck edge. Someone else nailed a temporary board over the gap they'd been stepping across all morning like it was nothing. Only then did anyone go looking for the man who screamed. They found him on a lower landing, curled around his own shoulder, face grey with shock. A bolt had punched into him high and hard, the kind of strike that doesn't look like much until the swelling blooms and the breathing turns shallow. A supervisor appeared, eyes moving fast, and made the same calculation as always. What did the street see? He ordered canvas up on the nearest opening facing outward. He ordered the injured man moved inward, away from sight lines. Then he leaned toward a timekeeper and spoke low enough that only the closest men heard. "How long were we stopped?" 4 minutes, the timekeeper said. The supervisor nodded like that was the real injury. Miguel stood with his empty hands, staring at the bolts that had become a weapon without anyone intending it. A foreman grabbed his sleeve. "Watch your damn feet," the foreman snapped, and it wasn't cruelty. It was the site's religion. If you turn an accident into a lesson, you can pretend it won't happen again without ever slowing down. Miguel swallowed. Doesn't matter, the foreman cut in. You want to keep working, you keep moving. Above them, the structure kept climbing, and the wind kept getting smarter. It learned the angles of open floors, it found the gaps between tubes, it pushed on hanging loads until taglines whipped like lashes. Men started wearing their fear as routine, and routine as armour. Ray Kowalski went back out on the iron an hour later with a stiff neck and a quieter face. He didn't talk about the slip. Nobody did. Talking made things real, and real things demanded change. And on this job, change was always scheduled for later. The tower rose on the same principle it began with. Not courage, not pride, just the stubborn forward motion of a machine that treated every human problem as something to root around. By the time the steel reached the next tier of tubes, the job stopped feeling like a building and started feeling like a vertical city with one law. Everything had to travel upward. Steel could wait on the ground. Men couldn't. Concrete couldn't. Bolts, decking, tools, welding machines, heating blankets, every single thing had to be threaded through temporary openings and lifted past swinging loads, past wind, past men who were already tired. That's what people miss when they talk about skyscrapers like they're just engineering. The real danger is logistics at altitude. When the tower is rising, the entire site becomes a narrow throat, and anything that gets stuck in that throat turns violent. A hoist operator named Len Carver worked from a little platform that felt like it was hanging off the side of nothing. He wasn't on the iron, but he might as well have been. His world was a cable, a drum, a hook, and a series of shouted signals that could be swallowed by wind at the exact wrong second. He learned to read hands, not voices. A flat palm meant stop. A circle meant up. A frantic wave meant somebody just realized they were standing in the swing. That morning, they were pouring a deck in cold weather. Grey air, breath visible, the steel underfoot slick in patches where frost held on. A deck pour day was supposed to be routine. Metal decking already laid, reinforcing set, forms tight, then concrete pumped and spread while finishers worked fast before it stiffened. In Chicago winter, before it stiffened was a race inside the race. Tarps snapped in the wind around a partial enclosure. Salamander heaters rumbled, throwing heat in one direction and diesel stink in the other. Steam drifted off damp steel like the building was exhaling. Men in thick gloves carried rebar chairs and shouted at each other to keep moving, because stopping meant your hands went numb and numb hands dropped things. A concrete hose came up through a temporary opening, thick as a man's thigh, pulsing as the pump pushed. When the hose is full, it has its own will. It bucks and twists if you don't control it. The nozzle man, Freddy Alvarez, stocky, face always spattered with grey, held it like a weapon he was trying to keep pointed down. Two others braced him by the shoulders, boots wide, knees bent, fighting the push of the line. The first warning that the day was going wrong wasn't a scream, it was a snap, not a cable, wood. A temporary plank walkway, laid over an opening to keep traffic flowing, shifted under a pallet jack. One end wasn't seated the way it should have been. It flexed, then jumped a fraction. Nobody would have noticed if they weren't already on edge. A runner named Miguel Santos, back again because the job always found a way to reuse the young and fast, came through carrying a box of anchor bolts. He was watching the hose, watching the men wrestling it, calculating his path around wet concrete like it was a living thing. He didn't see the plank edge lift. His boot hit it. The box jerked, his weight pitched forward, and suddenly the opening that had been covered became a trapdoor. Miguel didn't drop cleanly. His knee caught, then slipped, then his whole lower body vanished into the void up to his hips. The box slammed against the deck and split open. Bolts spilled into the opening, rattling down into darkness like coins being poured into a well. Miguel screamed then, short, raw, because the edge bit into his ribs and he felt himself sliding. Two men lunged for him and grabbed his arms. The first pull didn't move him. The plank edge had him wedged and the slickness beneath his boot kept dragging him deeper. A third man hooked an arm under Miguel's shoulder and hauled with his whole weight. Miguel came up over the lip, chest scraping wood, gasping like he'd been underwater. His face was grey with shock. He lay there with both hands clamped to his ribs as if he could hold his bones in place. For one breath the deck froze. Then the foreman's voice cut through. Cover it right, nail it. Now, we're pouring. Not, is he alive? Not, call it. Not, stop the pump. Pouring concrete is a timer you can't pause without consequences. If you stop too long, it sets where it shouldn't. It loads the deck unevenly. It creates a mess that takes hours to fix. And hours were poison on this job. So the machine did what machines do. It stabilized the process first. Freddy Alvarez swung the hose away from the opening and yelled for the pump to keep coming. The finishers moved in, spreading and screeding. A carpenter slammed fresh boards over the gap and drove nails like he was angry at the wood. Miguel tried to sit up. A supervisor pushed him back down with a firm hand. "Don't move," he said, not kindly, not cruelly, just controlled. "You want to faint and fall again?" Miguel's lips moved. "My ribs." "I know," the supervisor said, eyes already scanning. "You can breathe, you're fine, we'll get you checked. Off the deck." Off the deck. Away from view. Away from where the story could be witnessed. Len Carver watched this from his hoist station and felt something he hated. Relief that it wasn't a fatal fall, because relief meant the machine could pretend it hadn't been close. A few minutes later, as if to punish that relief, the hose bucked. A surge came through the line, maybe a change in pump pressure, maybe a kink, maybe just the building shifting in wind. The hose whipped sideways like a struck animal. Freddy fought it, boots sliding on wet concrete. A man bracing him lost his footing and went down on one knee. The nozzle swung past a column and slammed into a finisher's shoulder with a heavy wet thud. The finisher, Stan Wozniak, older, slower, reliable, made a sound that was all breath. He dropped the rake and crumpled, clutching his shoulder as if he could keep it attached by force. Concrete splashed across his jacket. Grey slurry ran down his sleeve like paint. The foreman swore, not because Stan was hurt, because the poor line had been disrupted. They dragged Stan out of the wet zone and toward the enclosure edge. Someone wrapped his shoulder in a jacket. Someone offered him a cigarette with shaking fingers. Stan's face was pale, eyes glassy, jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped. A superintendent appeared, eyes sharp, and made two decisions in a row. First, keep pouring, keep finishing. Second, no one leaves this deck to talk. You need medical, you go through the stair core, not the exterior. That's how control works on big jobs. You don't need to invent lies. You just need to manage routes, where people move, what the street can see, which stories get to travel. By evening, the deck was set enough to walk. The heaters still rumbled, the tarp still snapped. Miguel sat on a crate with his ribs taped tight, breathing shallow. Stan was gone, sent down in the hoist with his arm pinned against his chest. No announcement, no moment. Above them, The next steel was already coming in, because the tower didn't care what day it was. The bundled frame kept asking for the same thing it had asked for from the beginning: lift, align, bolt, repeat, while the wind tested every step and every shortcut. And somewhere between almost fell and injured off the deck, the job did what it always did. It routed around the human part and kept building. The higher the bundled frame climbed, the more the tower stopped forgiving small mistakes. Wind didn't just push anymore, it grabbed. It found the open edges of unfinished floors, it caught tarps like sails, it tugged on hanging loads until taglines snapped tight and whipped. Men started speaking in shorter sentences, because long sentences got stolen. A steel package came up one morning with the wind quartering hard off the lake. The hoist operator held it steady as long as he could, but steady up there was always temporary. The load rotated a few degrees, then corrected, then rotated again, slow, heavy, patient. Every connector on the receiving edge watched it like a predator. Ray Kowalski was back on the iron, neck still stiff from his earlier slip, moving like he was pretending not to feel it. He wasn't the star of anything. He was just one more man doing the job because the job kept calling. The beam drifted toward the bolt holes. Hands reached, wrenches readied. The foreman shouted the same words he always shouted: up, down, easy, like language could control physics. Then the beam snagged. Not on something obvious, on a corner of temporary decking that was supposed to be cleared. A metal lip caught the load for a fraction of a second, and that fraction turned the beam into a spring. It flexed, freed itself, and swung back with the stored anger of a thing that had been restrained. Ray didn't jump. There wasn't space to jump. He did the move men do when they're trained to keep a load from becoming lethal. He stepped in to control it. The beam kissed him in the shoulder, not enough to throw him off, enough to twist his torso and steal his footing. His boot slid on cold steel. For one moment he was hanging by one hand and one choice. The choice wasn't fall or don't fall. The choice was pull yourself in, or become a weight that drags someone else with you. His fingers slipped. He dropped. From below, the fall looked unreal. Too fast, too quiet. A body shrinking past levels of open air, past temporary platforms, past men who flinched but didn't move because moving under a fall is how you add a second body. Then the sound arrived. Impact on a lower landing hard enough that the whole frame seemed to wince. For a breath, the wind was the only noise. Then the machine restarted itself. "Hold the load!" the foreman screamed. "Hold it! Bolt it!" The crane operator held. The connector crew snapped back into motion with the shock still on their faces. Because if the load kept swinging, the next death would be immediate and plural. 2 men went down the interior stair core, not the exterior. Not where anyone outside the fence could look up and see them carrying a broken body. Inside the concrete and steel throat, where the tower could hide its own bleeding. They brought Ray up onto a flat surface and tried to make him breathe. Someone loosened his jacket. Someone pressed fingers to his neck. Someone kept saying his name too loudly, like volume could pull a man back from the edge he'd already crossed. Ray's eyes were half open. His mouth moved once, soundless. His chest rose shallow, then didn't rise again. A superintendent appeared, face tight and controlled, and made 2 decisions the way men in charge always do when a job is both dangerous and political. First, medical through the core, no exterior. Second, work continues. Nobody argued. Not because they didn't feel it, because they felt it too much, and the only way to keep standing on steel after watching a man die is to behave like the job expects you to behave. Canvas went up. Routes changed. A guard was posted where the sight line from the street was cleanest. The hoist schedule resumed. The next beam came up like nothing had happened, and this is the part people don't want to imagine. The tower doesn't stop for death, because stopping has consequences that hit everyone. Concrete setting wrong, loads waiting, crews idle, bosses furious, paychecks threatened. That's not a justification. It's the mechanism. It's how a human event gets converted into a logistical problem. In a small office near the perimeter, a man in a clean coat spoke into a phone with a voice that sounded rehearsed even when it wasn't. "Yes," he said. "There was an accident. No, we're handling it. No details yet." The phrase "no details yet" wasn't about respect. It was about control. Out on the steel, the men didn't talk about Ray in full sentences. They spoke in fragments: slipped, snag, wind, as if keeping it incomplete would keep it from becoming a story that demanded change. A young worker stood with his hands shaking and stared at his gloves like he couldn't trust them anymore. Frenchie Gosselin, older now in the face, still precise, leaned in and said the worst comfort a sight like this can offer. "Don't let it make you hesitate." The kid swallowed. "How do you not?" "You do," Frenchie cut him off. "You just do it later, not up here." That afternoon the tower looked magnificent from the street. Steel cutting into sky, workers like dots, cranes like insects. People pointed and smiled. Somebody said it was proof the city was still alive. Inside the fence, men stepped over the spot where the frame had shuddered when Ray hit below, because the job doesn't leave memorials in its path, it leaves progress. At the top out, cameras came, suits came, hard hats that had never been scuffed came. A small ceremony formed around a moment that could be photographed. Handshakes, smiles, a sense of triumph designed for headlines. Nobody mentioned the canvas. Nobody mentioned the interior stair core. Nobody mentioned the way a man's death can be routed like a problem so the schedule doesn't flinch. And that's the dark history of how towers are really built. Not with evil plans, just with incentives so strong they turn silence into professionalism. The skyline becomes permanent. The workers remain temporary. Their names don't rise with the steel unless someone insists on carrying them upward. If you want to be part of one community that tells the real cost behind monuments, subscribe so we stay together here. Hit like if you believe these stories deserve daylight, and comment one thing. When you look at a skyscraper, do you trust the legend, or do you assume there's a price buried inside it?